We're going to be studying from Matthew chapter 2. I call it Wise Eyes, or if you just spell it W-E-Y-E-S, it would just be wise, I guess, if you wanted to pronounce it that way. But the passage that I wanted to talk to you about today is from Matthew chapter 2. Now, I've excerpted here on the overhead verses 1 through 6 and verses 9 through 11. But I'd like to focus our attention on the Magi. You know, every Christmas we talk about the birth of Christ, and that would be appropriate. On Easter we talk about his resurrection, that would be appropriate. And, you know, you can hear a number of different Christmas messages associated with Christmas, whether it's Jesus or whether it's the angels or whether it's Mary or Joseph. There's not a lot of talk given to the Magi, I think, and so I just decided that perhaps this Sunday we can focus on that because there are some very important lessons that we can all gain from the Magi. And so we study now from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 6, and then verses 9 through 11. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we've come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. And so he called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." Skipping now to verse 9 through 11. After this, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was born. And when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. You know, for many of us during the holidays, it's highway time. We have a number of our family here who are traveling and away from us, a few who have come here to visit with us. But holiday time seems to be often highway time. And ever since the Magi packed their bags for Bethlehem, the birth of Jesus has basically caused people to just hit the road. And those Christmas trips, I think, in some ways, have a lot in common with the ones about the wise men. Now, we don't camp out with camels, of course, but we've been known to bump into some knobby-kneed in-laws, perhaps passing toward the dining room table. And we don't really keep an eye out for the starlights like the wise men did, but we do keep an eye out for the red and blue lights of, let's say, the CHP or the local law enforcement community. We're looking for them at every corner. And we don't ride in this kind of Spice Road caravan like the Magi did many years ago. But 6 hours in a minivan with kids might have made the wise men thankful that they were traveling with animals. Because as you know, it's not always ho, ho, ho on the highway. Extended time in the car reveals a lot about human frailties, doesn't it? For instance, dads just simply refuse to stop. They just don't. They apparently hearken back to the example of their forefathers. For instance, did the pioneers spend the night at the Holiday Inn? No. Did Lewis and Clark ask for directions? No. Did Joseph allow Mary to stroll through the souvenir shop on the way to Bethlehem? No. Men drive as if they have a biblical mandate to travel as far and as fast as possible, stopping only for gasoline. And the children? Well, road trips do to kids what the full moon sometimes does to the wolf man. Because, with your kids in the car, if one of them says, wow, I really like that song, as a parent, you want to hear the other child say, yes, that's a lovely song. But that's not what you hear. That's not going to happen. When the one child says, I really like that song, the other child typically says, that song stinks and so does your feet. And then there's, of course, the issue of the bathroom stops. With the dad who is driving without any stops whatsoever, it's a miracle to me how a child at home can basically go for weeks and never use the bathroom. And yet they get in the car and they have to stop at every location on the road to check out the latest and the greatest bathroom stop that they can find. The kids basically start leaking like Washington, D.C. secrets. And I think the best advice for traveling with young children is just to be very grateful that they are not teenagers. Because teens are embarrassed at whatever their parents say, think, wear, eat, or even sing. So for their sakes, if you ever want to see your future grandchildren, you don't want to smile at the wait staff at the restaurant where you stop, you don't want to breathe, and you don't want to sing with the windows down or even with the windows up. Because frankly, it's probably wiser to just simply postpone traveling with children until they're a more reasonable age, like 30-something. So Christmas, I think, and travel have a lot in common. And it seems to me that the first has always been a way of prompting the second. And it's been that way since the delegation from the distant land came searching for Jesus. Because in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, it says, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, where is the newborn King of the Jews? And I have to tell you that I think Matthew, in particular, really loved the Magi, the wise men, or as my kids used to say, the wise guys. Because Matthew, in particular, gave more square inches of text than he even gave to the narrative of Jesus' birth. If you read through the Matthew account of Jesus and his life, he spends a lot of time talking about the wise men and very little time spent actually about the narrative of Jesus actually being born. In fact, Matthew never mentions shepherds. He doesn't mention the manger. But for whatever reason, Matthew didn't want us to miss the star and the seekers who are following the star. And I think it's easy to see why, because their story of the Magi is very similar to ours. Because in a sense, we're all travelers, right? We're all sojourners. And in order to find Jesus, every one of us needs direction. And God provides it. The story of the wise men shows us exactly how God did that. Matthew 2, verse 2. We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. I don't think it's a newsflash to any of us that God uses the natural world to get our attention. For instance, the psalmist in Psalm 19, verse 1 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. So God led the wise men to Jerusalem with a star. But to lead them to Jesus, he used something else. Again, the Matthew 2 account. King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, where is the Messiah that's supposed to be born? In Bethlehem in Judea, they said, for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel. That's verses 3 through 6. You see, church, the star wasn't enough to lead the Magi to Jerusalem. It took Scripture to lead them to Jesus. Because people see signs every day. You know, we see sunsets that steal the breath. I mean, you don't have to wander too far off of any newscast in the evenings, and people are always lobbing sunset photos that they've taken to give to the newscasters so they can post all these pretty pictures. God sends those. These sunsets that can steal your breath, or a newborn baby that can bring you to tears. But not everyone who sees the signs draws near to God. Because many are, frankly, just content to see the signs. They don't realize that the riches of God are intended to turn us toward Him. In fact, Paul, writing to the church in Rome, in Romans chapter 2, verse 4, said the following: "Perhaps you do not understand that God is kind to you, so you will change your hearts and lives." The wise men, however, understood the purpose of the sign. They followed it to Jerusalem, where they heard then about the Scripture. The prophecy, the Scripture, told them where to find Jesus. And it's interesting to note, at least for me, that the star reappears after the Magi had learned about the prophecy, because it says in Matthew chapter 2, verse 9, the star came and stood shining right over the place where the child was. You see, it's as if the sign and the word were working together to bring the wise men to Jesus. That's because the ultimate aim of all of God's messages, His word and or signs, is to shed the light of heaven on His Son, Jesus. Matthew 2, verse 11, they came to the house where the child was, and they saw Him with His mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped Him. They opened their gifts and gave Him treasures of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And in that context, church, this very simple dwelling becomes a cathedral. And the seekers of the Christ child found Him and knelt in His presence. And then they gave Him gifts. Gifts of gold for a king, and frankincense for a priest, and myrrh that was used for burials. They found the Christ because they heeded the sign and believed the Scripture. Because noticeably absent in this manger and these scenes that we see all the time were the scholars of the Torah. Where are all the religious know-it-alls in this situation? The people who are supposed to know the truth. The people who are supposed to be telling the truth. The people who are supposed to be leading the people toward a knowledge of God. Where are they? They reported to Herod that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. So it's always raised this question in my mind, well, didn't they read the prophecy? I mean, they quoted it to the king. Well, if they had quoted it to the king, they must have read it. And if they read it, did they believe it? Apparently not. Because they didn't even follow the prophecy. And they're supposed to be the religious smart people. They didn't respond to it. And you'd think that at a minimum, they would have at least accompanied the Magi to Bethlehem. I mean, the village wasn't that far away from Jerusalem, number one. And the risks were really small if they followed the Magi and the Magi found nothing. At worst, they'd have been out a little effort. But at best, they would have seen the fulfillment of prophecy. But the priests, the people who should have known better, showed no interest whatsoever. The wise men, on the other hand, earned that particular moniker because they did. You see, their hearts were open to God's gift, and the men were never the same. After worshiping the Christ child, they departed for their own country another way. It says in Matthew chapter 2, verse 12. Now, we do know from the narrative that they were instructed to go a different way because obviously Herod wanted to kill the Christ child. But it's interesting to note that Matthew uses the word way. They went a different way. And he has used that same word in other places in his gospel, in Matthew. For instance, he uses the word way when he speaks of the narrow way. Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. He also uses the word way in the way of righteousness. And that's Matthew chapter 21, verse 32. Those are just a couple of examples. Matthew is very intentional about using the word way. And it gives the connotation that it's a change in direction in life. And maybe what he's telling us is that the wise men went home as different men. They were changed. They went home a different way. Directionally, yes, but perhaps emotionally and spiritually well. They were there worshiping the Christ child. They gave this child gifts that were very expensive. They had traveled a great distance, following a star. And when they left, they were changed. They went home a different way. Because they were called by a sign, they were instructed by Scripture, and they were directed home by God. It's as if all the forces of heaven had been cooperating to guide these wise men. And I think God uses every possible means available to communicate with people like you and me. The wonders of nature, they call to us. The promises and prophecies of Scripture, they speak to us. God himself reaches out to us. He wants to help you find your way home. Many years ago, I watched a television adaptation of a drama. It's called The Miracle Worker. I don't know if you've seen that television show or this kind of adaptation of that drama, but it's this very compelling story about two females that had tremendous resolve. One is Helen Keller, and the other one is Annie Sullivan. Helen was born in 1880, and she wasn't yet 2 when she contracted some sort of illness that left her blind, deaf, and mute. When Helen was 7 years old, Annie, this young, partially blind teacher herself, came to the Kellers' Alabama home to help serve as Helen Keller's teacher. Helen's brother, James, tried to convince Annie to quit, but Annie wouldn't consider it. She was committed to helping Helen function in a world of sight and sound where Helen couldn't find either sight or sound. And Helen was just as stubborn as her teacher. Because Helen was now locked in this frightening, lonely world. And at the beginning, Helen unfortunately misinterpreted Annie's attempts at trying to communicate, attempts at signing. Helen didn't understand, and the result was this titanic clash of the wills between Helen on the one hand and Annie on the other. And over and over and over again, Annie would press sign language into Helen's palm. But Helen would then pull back. She had no idea what Annie was doing, poking on her palm. And Annie persisted, and Helen resisted, and it continued for years. Finally, in a moment of very high drama, a breakthrough occurs. And it's during one of these fevered exchanges where Annie is trying to put this sign language into Helen's palm, and Helen is resisting, that they happen to get into this argument basically out by a water pump. And Annie places Helen's hand under the spout of the flowing water coming out of the water pump. And into the hand, she spells water, water, water. W-A-T-E-R, over and over and over and over again. Water, water, water. And Helen is pulling back. But Annie persisted. She kept signing W-A-T-E-R. And all of a sudden, Helen stopped. She placed her hand on her teacher's hand and repeated the letters W-A-T-E-R. And as you can imagine, the teacher is now beaming. Finally, I got through. And she lifted Helen's head and put it to Annie's cheek and nodded, yes, 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 water, W-A-T-E-R, yes, water. And at that point in time, Helen then starts pulling Annie around the entire yard outside, and she starts spelling out words. G-R-O-U-N-D for the ground, P-O-R-C-H for the porch, P-U-M-P for the water pump. I mean, it was a victory parade of sorts for both Helen and for Annie. And I think sometimes, church, Christmas can bring similar moments for us because it's God breaking through into our world and in a feeding stall of all places. God's not going to leave us in the dark. He is the pursuer. He is the teacher. He won't sit back while we miss out. So he entered our world, and he sends signals and he sends messages. And they are spelled H-O-P-E, hope, and L-I-F-E, life. And he spells it over and over and over again. He says it in signs. He says it in his word. He says it in ways that we react with other people. There's hope. There's life through this Christ child, Jesus. He cracks the shell of our world like Annie finally did and invites us to peek into his own. And every so often, a seeking soul will look up and see and understand the sign. This Christmas season, church, may you be one of them. When God sends signs, be faithful. Let them lead you to Scripture. And as Scripture directs, be humble. And let it lead you to worship. And as you worship the Son, be grateful, because he will lead you home. This Christmas, may God give you wise eyes to see, and a heart humbled by this babe in a manger. This Christmas, may you be changed by the Christ who gave his life so that you might find your own forever. You can learn a lot from wise people. Maybe someday a wise man will figure out why men don't stop and ask for directions. And not to beat up on the men, maybe another wise person will tell us how a woman can apply her makeup while she's driving. It takes a wise person to figure that out. May you be wise this Christmas. See the sign. Let it follow you and let it direct you to his word. Read his word. Internalize it and then act on it. When you act on it, be humble and let it lead you to worship. Let it lead you to bring gifts to a worship service like the wise men. Not necessarily gold and frankincense and myrrh, but each of you is particularly gifted with something that is unique, something only you can do. Maybe it's your voice as you sing. Maybe it's your heart as you pray. Maybe it's you holding the hand of somebody sitting next to you. Maybe it's you being a parent and raising your children. Maybe it's you being an older person and having some wisdom. Every single one of you has a gift that we want you to bring to worship every day. Be wise like the Magi some 2,000 years ago. Let the sign direct you, but then let the word instruct you. And then let it have an effect on you so that when you leave this place, you go a different way. Be changed this Christmas. Be wise this Christmas. And have a very Merry Christmas. So we've selected a song that we're going to close our services with. It's a challenging song. It's got like high F's and high G's, but Steve can do it. And as we sing this song, if you have anything that you want us to be mindful of in prayer, you can pass up those prayer requests. We'll pray over those, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and let's sing.